It's the week ending Saturday the 7th of July, and this is The Week Unwrapped, sponsored by Barclays Corporate Banking. In the past 7 days, we've seen evidence the Vote Leave campaign broke electoral law, 2 people struck down by a nerve agent in Wiltshire, and England winning a World Cup penalty shootout for the very first time. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team are Arion McNicoll, Felicity, Capon, and Holden, Frith. And starting the show this week is Arion. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
I'm wondering whether this is the week we rediscovered the sound of silence.
The soothing sound there of a construction site. Arion, why?
Yeah, good question. So there was a really interesting article in The Guardian this week by Richard Godwin, who was talking about the detrimental effects of noise on human health. And in it, he cited this really staggering statistic from the European Environment Agency that blames 10,000 deaths across Europe every year on noise.
Wow.
Yeah, and another 43,000 hospital admissions and another 900,000 cases of hypertension.
Okay, so this isn't people going up to people in the street and going boo, is it? This is what? The sort of incessant, slow noise of airplane flight paths, things like that?
Two types of noise that he's talking about. One is the kind of perpetual, constant low-frequency noise, and that's the kind of airplanes and highways and background noise that we experience from the world around us. And then the other is intermittent peak noise, and that's things like neighbours' parties, performances in parks and that sort of thing. So the two types of noise largely found in inner cities, but they can exist everywhere.
And Felicity, that does sound like an exciting statistic, but also I'm thinking immediately there are so many different factors involved when measuring people's lifestyles who live in different areas of the cities, you know, their economic background, which culture they come from, etc., etc. Can you really trace those deaths back to noise?
I think you probably can, because I think also a lot of the time we link to mental health. So I think a lot of people, it will, especially living in cities, it will affect your sleep and probably lead to things like, I think the article talked about the stress hormone cortisol going up. And I mean, ironically, it's a bit of a silent killer because it's something that maybe you sound a bit precious or a bit, you know, if you sort of say, oh, this noise is really affecting me, it makes you sound a bit sort of wimpy maybe, but I think actually it probably is like a really deadly killer that we're just not paying any attention to. I definitely feel more, I think living in London, you definitely feel more stressed by the level of noise around you. I certainly feel that.
But Holden, there is a legal distinction, isn't there, between nuisance noise and noise pollution, actually saying this is the level that is actually legally intolerable. There are laws there.
Yes, and it's one of the most complained about subjects to local councils, mostly about noisy neighbours rather than roads or aircraft noise. The study did attempt to isolate the effect of noise as opposed to air pollution or other factors of those sorts. I'm sure it's very difficult to do that, but the statistical methods were used to their full extent to try and isolate exactly what is being caused by noise rather than other factors. What it couldn't do is differentiate between different types of noise, and I imagine part of the reason for that is that the way we experience noise is very different depending on our own experiences. So the noise of people celebrating a penalty shootout win during the week is probably less stressful to hear than a similar decibel level caused by a fight amongst your neighbours, or even the sort of construction noise we heard in the clip at the beginning of the discussion.
Yeah, and in fact, my upstairs neighbours changed a little while ago, and they previously, my neighbours had small kids who used to run around back and forth making annoying noises on our ceiling. But I didn't mind that because it was kids doing it, and then in came
a middle-aged couple, and they started running up and down singing songs.
No, sort of a younger woman who's my age, and she had more parties and more music, and I found that more irritating because it seemed avoidable, whereas the kids running around, that was kind of not their fault. So I agree, it depends on the type of noise as well.
And I think that the flip side of this argument as well is as Felicity was alluding to, there has been a run of cases of people moving into areas which already have really well-established music venues or have kind of nightlife that is really part of the culture of that area. And then they move into these very expensive new flats, start complaining about the fact there's noise and trying to get them all shut down, and in some cases succeeding.
It's to do with context, isn't it? And also whether you expect noise from your daily surroundings or not, and when it's a bit of a shock or a bit of surprise or it's something that's different from what you're used to. But I mean, if you take it to its very extreme, noise is used as a form of torture, isn't it? And I think, I was reading into this idea of what the US military calls torture light. I mean, they're not sort of chopping off people's fingers or gouging out eyes, but they play music at, cacophonous levels to people at Guantanamo Bay or at detention centres on the Iraqi-Syrian border. And it's the accounts of prisoners who have been subjected to it's horrifying. They feel like their brains are going to burst out of their skulls. And some of them actually say, I'd rather have physical pain than this sort of light torture, because it can break you in 4 days. You'll be a shivering wreck. And I mean, I know that's not, you're sort of looking at me as if that's not at all what we're talking about in London or in any cities, but it does. I think it can have that effect on people. It's horrible.
And if it disturbs your sleep and you just feel that you can't get away from it, I imagine that can be a bad situation to be in.
But what I found quite interesting about the article is Richard Godwin in that suggested that, I mean, it was in The Guardian, so perhaps this is par for the course, but suggested that it's to do with your personal economic status, that if you live in an area of the city that's close to Heathrow Airport and the M4, for example, where your house value might be lower, people just expect you to have to put up with the sound of lots of trucks going past on the way to the airport. Whereas if you're rich, then you get double glazing.
Yeah.
But I was reading that and thinking, just like you said, Holden, about theatres and pubs. I mean, that massive new block here in London that's just gone up at Centre Point is the most expensive development we've seen for years. The flats are £2 million each. That's above one of the busiest roads in London. It's next to the Dominion Theatre where Bat Out of Hell is on. I mean, presumably there is quite a lot of noise there.
Yeah.
And actually that's going to affect millionaires just the same, isn't it?
Yes, and I suppose as I understand it, the law distinguishes between the background noise of a highway that really you have no right to complain about and the kinds of noises that are being made by Bat Out of Hell. So in actual fact, you do have this negative consequence, an unexpected negative consequence of mass construction of further residential in cities around the country, because the more people get close to these historical sites of, say, performance and music venues, the more of those venues are shutting down. But the connection that Godwin makes between poverty and exposure to noise actually is well documented, because poor people just do happen to live in noisier places next to highways and so on.
I'd say it's not so much that they happen to live there, it's actually it's priced into the houses. So I would see that argument really from the other perspective, in that it's the more desirable a home is, the more expensive it's going to be. And so it's not that we're putting noise where poor people live, it's that poorer people are living closer to sources of noise, because that's where the cheaper housing is. And I'm not sure there's really a way around that.
But Felicity, rich people live in Hampstead and Chelsea and Kensington, where people are digging into their basements and building new houses below. So it does affect everybody.
Well, yeah, and it mentioned that in the article too, that's causing a lot of noise, is that people digging deep, these sort of iceberg homes is creating a lot of noise. I wonder whether it's something that, I mean, it must affect people differently, but also more people are choosing to live in cities. So maybe it's something that they feel that it's the price of progress.
It may also be that the advantages, whether it's quality of life or perhaps even health, of living in a city outweigh those of being in rural areas, where the very fact that you are isolated may also have a detrimental effect on your health, perhaps if you can't get to treatment centres, or if your loneliness is leading to mental health problems, but actually just the quality of life as well. And people may even prefer to have a slightly shorter life if they're going to have the richer life of a city existence.
Arion, can you actually throw some science stats at us? How does this affect your blood biochemistry?
Yes, there was a study that was published in the Lancet journal a couple of weeks ago that was really talking about what noise exposure does. And it does the obvious things. It disturbs sleep and increases the occurrence of hypertension. But then it also impairs cognitive performance, they were saying. So it's just this sort of low-level perpetual strain on your brain. And all of that serves to contribute to cardiovascular disease. So the long-term association is noise ultimately leading to heart attacks.
Okay. And if this is the most important story of the week, if this is a moment that causes people, town planners, people building new residential blocks, to change the way they approach our noise pollution, what's going to actually happen?
Well, I read an interesting article about this, about how people do want their cities to become quieter and all the technology that's being designed to combat the noise. And so lots of people have sound cancelling headphones, people wearing earplugs when they go to sleep, and then bigger designs as well. So it's about the need to go green. So hybrid cars, electric cars are a lot quieter. A technology that wailing sirens would only go directly to the cars or people on the streets that needed to get out of the way. I don't know how realistic or plausible that is, but I think it's something people are definitely thinking about. The only thing I thought with hybrid or electric is that I think there's been a lot of criticism that if vehicles are really quiet, doesn't that make them more deadly on the roads? Like, would we actually prefer our vehicles to be noisy so that, children can get out of the way? But I think it is something that people are thinking about.
Okay, Felicity, let's find out what else you've been reading this week. What is your choice for the story of the week?
Was this the week we wish we could turn back the sands of time?
We use sand way more than you'd expect. Worldwide, we go through 50 billion tons of sand every year. That is twice the amount produced by every river in the world. After air and water, sand is our most used natural resource. We use it even more than oil. We use it to make food, wine, toothpaste, glass, computer chips, breast implants, cosmetics, paper, paint, and plastics.
Vince Beiser, author of The World in a Grain, speaking to Tech Insider. Felicity, sand.
Yes, sand. Ollie, I've got a question for you.
Right.
How many grains of sand do you think there are in the world? And you can round it up or down to the nearest quintillion.
It's summer fate season, isn't it? This is what you do at the school fair.
Yeah.
Except with quintillions.
Jar of sweets as your prize.
I mean, I didn't even know the unit measurement was quintillion, but since you've given it me, I'm going to say 100 quintillion.
No.
Well,
it's 7.5 times 10 to the 18th power, which is 7 quintillion 500 quadrillion.
Okay, well, that's a fact everyone can use in the pub. So what?
Well, I mean, actually, there are very many grains of sand in the world.
Yes,
but
and
we're running out.
So,
we're running out.
we're running out. This was the week
out.
we found out we're running out of sand.
Yes,
That
well,
sounds
I did.
ludicrous. Explain
It
why.
does sound ludicrous, but this is an article by Neil Tweedy that was also in The Guardian this week, who has sort of looked into this massive disaster that's unfolding before our eyes, except that we're not sort of really aware of it. And we use sand in absolutely everything, as the clip was explaining. Most of all, it's used in concrete, which is used to build so much. And it's really running out because people are just exploiting this resource so much.
Exploiting by what? Building homes?
Yes, by building homes, by
Breast implants.
Glass windows, computer chips, window panes, wine glasses, mobile phone screens. Our whole world is built on sand.
I mean, forgive me, this is going to sound really stupid, but I genuinely hadn't really imagined. I mean, my house is being rebuilt at the moment. I hadn't really imagined when I'd seen those concrete mixers outside.
Yes,
my building sand.
You're the foolish man building your house on sand,
right.
out of sand.
Yeah. Was sand. I just kind of thought, I don't know, that building sand was something different, that it might be man-made, or, that it comes from something else, something local. But to make building sand, they import sand from sandy places, do they?
Well, yes, but crucially not deserts, because that's the wrong kind of sand. The wind makes it too round and curved, so it's useless. So you would look at the Sahara Desert and think, can't we just use that? But you can't. It has to come from riverbeds or other places.
And those riverbeds are in your home country, Arion.
They are, yeah. You're stealing directly from me.
But am I stealing, or isn't this a huge export industry for Australia? You do have a lot of sand as well. It's not just the Sahara.
That's true. And I think that there's both a legal sand industry and an illegal sand industry. But in both cases, they're contributing to the problem, which is still the world is running out of sand.
It is running out of sand, and one of the most obvious examples of this was that Dubai, when it was building the Burj Khalifa, what was then the tallest building in the world, it had to turn to Australia to import sand because none of the sand in the Arabian desert was suitable for building. And in fact, now 85% of everything that is mined from the earth is either sand or gravel. That's partly because of the demand from China in particular, which is building huge amounts of land, but also actually land reclamation. So Singapore is now 20% bigger than it was in 1965. That's because it's simply built out land into the sea, and most of what it uses to raise the land level there is sand dredged from the oceans.
It is a geopolitical issue as well. China's using it to expand its territory in the South China Sea. So there's that to contend with too. And then also this thing called beach nourishment, which is dumping fresh sand on tourist beaches to combat erosion. And this is our obsession with heading to the beach. So things like pop-up beaches in urban areas is actually really, really bad too.
There's a more direct potential consequence as well, which is that as high quality building sand gets harder to come by, people are turning to desert sand, beach sand, dirty sand, which is cheaper. But if it has clay or silt, it retains moisture, which weakens the cement that's produced from it. If it isn't washed properly and comes from the seabed, then the salt in it can then erode steel that's used to reinforce it. Or if it's the desert sand that Felicity was talking about and it's too rounded, then that doesn't have the sort of structural strength. So particularly in countries which have either more lax building regulations or less enforcement, there is a risk of building collapse and potential deaths and destruction in that manner.
But isn't it a bit like the oil industry in that, yes, okay, it might be environmentally damaging to mine all of it and then come up with another solution, but human beings being what we are, that's probably what will happen. By the time all the oil's run out, we'll have another way of powering our cars and power. And isn't it the same with sand? We'll have another way. Engineers will find another way to build houses once they've used all the sand.
Yes, that's true, but I think that the reason this is actually one of those critical stories is that now is the time to start thinking about it. And you've got to start doing something about a problem before it's too late. And I think that we're getting towards that tipping point, at least from what the article was saying.
There have been moves to introduce man-made sand, essentially, which can be actually recycled plastics and fabrics.
Just sort of household
recycling. Yeah.
Excellent. Plastic problem and sand problem.
And
so why is that not caught on?
It's just more expensive at the moment, but this is something where the market should counteract the problem in that as natural sand becomes scarce and more expensive, and as we get better at producing artificial sand more cheaply, at one point those two prices will cross over. The risk is that at the moment it's much cheaper to get it from illicit sources, and because it is, despite the fact that we're running out of it, it does seem so plentiful, it is actually quite easy to get that either poor quality or damaging sand.
When Holden says illicit sources, what's he talking about?
Well, in India, there's something called the sand mafia, and they are taking sand from riverbeds where they're not supposed to be dredging, and that's having a massive effect on what. So it's just, I mean, I think there was a...
So there's black market sand gangsters.
Huge, yeah, and it's absolutely huge, and journalists or honest policemen who've been looking into it have been murdered. There was one extraordinary case in Jamaica where an entire beach disappeared overnight to be used. So and you can make so much more money from sand, whether legally or illegally, presumably much more illegally, than if your more traditional livelihood was, say, fishing, which isn't going to make you as much. So that's
really
tempting.
fascinating. But I mean, sand's heavy. I mean, how do you
pick up a
illicitly
beach?
Pick up a beach? I mean, yeah.
I have no idea. I'm not in the illegal sand
It's a
market.
struggle to get it through customs, I should imagine.
It's quite brazen, really, in India, isn't it? And the feeling is that probably backhanders have been paid to local officials or police to turn a blind eye.
Right.
But it does happen on a smaller scale elsewhere. There are cases in the UK of cowboy builders having, just taken a tipper truck to a beach and started attacking sand dunes and carting loads away.
I think the other problem is that in terms of the environmental agenda, it's sort of slipped sort of way down in that, I mean, it's having a massive effect on environments. When it's taken from riverbeds, it leaves shore communities vulnerable to flooding and erosion, and it's really bad for wildlife that sort of thrive and live off sand. But in terms of all the sort of environmental problems going on in the world, it's very, very low. So I think it's very easy to sort of overlook because we're more focused on, plastic or, other issues.
And that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, even Friends of the Earth and Greenpeace presumably would concede that it isn't the top priority. So then it's very hard to imagine that environmental campaigners can do much about this at the moment.
Well, yeah, and I think it is just flying massively below the radar, which is the problem.
The problem, but also wonderful for this show. Thank you, Felicity. Thank you for bringing it to the table. Finally this week, it's Holden, who hopefully has read something other than The Guardian. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
This is the week that David Attenborough gained some unlikely followers.
Al-Shabaab have been designated as a terrorist organization by several Western nations after losing control of 4 major cities. The Islamists were thought to have been defeated, but they still control large parts of the country and see themselves as an alternative government.
That was Channel 4 News reporting from inside an al-Shabaab training camp in Somalia in 2013. Holden, what's that got to do with David Attenborough? You built the rod for your own back here.
What it has to do with David Attenborough is that this week, al-Shabaab, the East African terrorist group which was responsible for the attack on the Westgate Mall in Nairobi a few years ago, announced that it was introducing a ban on single-use plastics, citing the damaging effect they would have on both humans and animals.
That is, I don't know why I'm smiling, but that is quite funny, isn't it? The idea of a civic-minded terror group.
It is, and this story did get a little bit of attention, but it was mostly in the vein of it being a novelty and just a slightly bizarre story, really. And it does seem out of character for a group that uses children as soldiers and as suicide bombers, and which attacks civilians, and which advocates for a system of sexual slavery, to suddenly come out and say, look, plastics are the real problem here.
Yeah.
But the reason I think it merits a bit more serious attention is that it actually seems to fit into a pattern of terrorist groups demonstrating a willingness and actually a talent for bureaucracy and really involving themselves in these sorts of civic programs, as well as the more fundamentalist and more violent aspects of their ideologies.
Yeah, I saw an article in the New York Times about the Islamic State when they were much more prevalent in Iraq, having quite an efficient policy of helping people who'd lost small amounts of money to thieves, for example.
Yeah, this was a batch of documents, and again, it's sort of showing that the Islamic State kept a lot of paperwork as it went about its business, and as well as detailing the sorts of violent retribution for perceived crimes against religion and morality that you might expect. There was a lot in there that was about very small-scale disputes. Some of the examples were an Islamic State fighter who had paid only $3.50 for a $7 chicken, somebody who was taking issue with the quality of a redecorating job that had been done on their home.
Illegal sound.
Quite possibly. A dispute about half a bag of sugar. And all of these were resolved very swiftly by the ISIS authorities. The soldier who'd only paid $3.50 had to go back and make good for the rest of the $7.
It's all about attempting to erect a veneer of legitimacy, isn't it? I think with al-Shabaab, someone in the article had commented that other East African governments are banning plastic bags, and if they do this too, it sort of makes them look like more legitimate rulers.
They're a government in waiting.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And the same with the Islamic State, which I thought was absolutely remarkable. I mean, but it's also practical in terms of getting civilians on side. That if they can be shown to be more effective than, say, the Iraqi government, then that's one in the bag for them. But it is incredible.
But doesn't
really.
calling it a veneer slightly do a disservice to the fact that, at least in the case of Islamic State, they were undertaking the building of a state. That was their intention. And yes, it may look like the means couldn't possibly justify the ends, particularly from the outside if you weren't sympathetic to the cause. But in the meantime, the fact that they were pumping oil and policing streets and collecting taxes and even planning to issue their own currency was really significant, because if they were to found an Islamic State, they were going to need to do statecraft. So it kind of bursts the bubble of us thinking about all of these groups, al-Shabaab and Islamic State included, being too transparently one-dimensional. And actually, there was a lot of thought in all of those groups going into the idea of working out what next.
Well, except it's sort of both, isn't it? I mean, it shows that they have a deft hand at PR and that the sort of foot soldiers on the ground really believed it. And, so long as you weren't homosexual or cheating on your husband or whatever, in which case you'd be stoned to death, at the time that you are owed $3, they're gonna step in and do what's right according to their beliefs.
Definitely.
I think it also shows part of the reason why there might not always be as much sort of grassroots resistance to these groups, because there was a line in the New York Times report which says the Islamic State aggressively prosecuted minor crimes in the communities it took over, winning points with residents who were used to having to pay bribes to secure police help. So there was a sort of subset of the population who felt that if they kept their heads down and didn't transgress the many points of law which ISIS introduced, they could actually get a better service from the Islamic State than they could have got from the national Iraqi government.
But the only troubling thing is that the ISIS system of rule was a totalitarian dictatorship. I mean, how much do we, underpinning all this, I think the reason so many people did hurry up to pay their fines was because underpinning this was this terrible...
They're going to be killed.
Yep. Yes, exactly. And also, how much do we really know? I think a lot of people who might be talking to us about what life was really like do so under massive fear or threat to their lives.
But if you think about the not so distant history of Iraq, the country was used to putting up with a certain amount of authoritarian rule in the form of Saddam Hussein before. Who
claimed the same kind of paternal attitude towards his
people,
but obviously wasn't really governing that way.
Yeah, so there'd been decades of life under that sort of a system that was thrown into absolute turmoil following the invasion of Iraq and then the establishment of a democracy that's really struggled and lurched from difficulty to difficulty. And so really, if a group comes offering some sort of stability, maybe you're willing to make those kinds of sacrifices.
The author of this, the New York Times article, Rukmini Callimachi, also has a podcast called The Caliphate, which is excellent and really tries to get inside the mindset both of the ISIS fighters but also the people who were under their yoke. And what becomes very clear is both what Felicity was saying, that this was an absolute horrific totalitarian rule, and part of the reason people jumped into line was because you would be dead if you did not. But I hate to present this as the kind of the light side of ISIS or the positive side of ISIS, but it did mean that some of these kind of low-level street-to-street civic issues were resolved in a way that did improve day-to-day lives for some people. And that's something that I think we kind of do have to wrestle with, and Western governments and the Iraqi government have to wrestle with when they're thinking about countering ISIS, because the obvious counterexample to this is the British and American invasion of Iraq, where absolutely no attention was paid to getting the power to run, getting the water into people's homes. And so that eroded any goodwill that there might have been to people who had liberated them from a fairly brutal dictator.
The Brookings Institution have done a series on whether ISIS were any good at governance. And they were. They did publish a booklet in 2007, which was their plan for how they were going to govern, and it was looking at things like electricity and water and fuel and food distribution. One of the commentators in the series had said it was when water and electricity began to get more expensive that public opinion of their rulers started to falter. And it just made me think, how likely would you be to sort of turn a blind eye to beheadings or whatever crucifixions are going on if, the little things in your life suddenly start to work? And there's that famous saying, which I think is, an absolute myth, that, say what you like about Mussolini, he made the trains run on time, which I think is not at all true. But it's that idea that you would turn a blind eye if your trains are working, if you had heat in your apartment, all that sort of thing, which is really troubling.
And you look at the outcome of the recent Iraqi election that's still kind of being fought over because there seem to be voting irregularities and it's still unclear quite what's going to be the result. But at least what seemed to be evident was that Muqtada al-Sadr had the majority of the vote. It's going to be recounted, but it looks likely that that's still going to be the case. And he, of course, was very anti-America. So even at a time where ISIS has just been overthrown, kind of with the support of America and its allies, there's still such a great deal of unhappiness with Haider al-Abadi's rule that they were willing to go for something that was entirely opposite. So it's a country that has just been in a state of chaos for so long.
To return to the plastic bag specifically, there's also a logical reason, to the extent that this sort of fundamentalist ideology has logic, in removing plastic bags, because part of the mindset of both ISIS and al-Shabaab is that we should return the world to the conditions of 7th century Arabia. Mm-hmm. And in 7th century Arabia, there were no plastic bags. And so just for that mind-blowingly obvious reason, this is a ban that makes perfect Islamic sense.
I mean, there weren't Kalashnikovs and M16s. So
these rules are always enforced in a very selective way.
So, Holden, you've chosen this story as your underreported story of the week, the one that deserved more attention. I mean, why? What do we learn from these stories?
I think in some ways it actually harks back a little bit to the question of noise pollution we were talking about earlier. I think what it taps into is a fairly fundamental human desire to make the world right about us, just to worry solely about what we can see and hear, And if what you can see and hear is your business selling chickens bringing in the $7 you were owed instead of the $3.50 you would have received under the old system, then for you, that's a step in the right direction.
And for politicians listening to this who perhaps don't want to set up totalitarian regimes but are interested in the kind of micro-politics as well as the macro-politics, that's an important lesson, isn't it? Think about how people experience your policies on the ground.
Yeah, try and make the little things right as well as presenting the big idea. And although it's a horrible thing to say, ISIS were actually pretty good at that. They had the big picture ideological sell, but then they were also working hard at making the small things work on the ground.
Okay, controversial point to end with. My thanks to Holden and to Arion and Felicity. That is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. In the meantime, please rate and review us on your podcast app of choice. That really helps us find new listeners and improve the show as well. And if you just want to listen to the show, then subscribe. You can stream at theweekunwrapped.com, but if you subscribe, then you'll get it and our bonus business episodes as well, delivered straight to your phone each week. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Rebecca Grisdale-Sherry for Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.